jump into this?
I'm going to go grab a charger just so you guys don't lose me. I'll be right back.
Great. Eric, how are you doing today, man?
Very well. Very well.
Thanks for being on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. You got it.
Good to see you again, Eric.
Hey, you as well, Jimmy.
There we go. Okay. We've got some attendees starting to pop in. Good.
Yep. I see we've got 11, right? Including us.
Yeah, I've got the attendee tab. Looks like a way of seeing the details. So I'm good there.
Good. Eric, you all good in terms of sharing your screen and everything?
I think so. Like I said, I mean, it looks very much like Zoom, so I think we're going to be in good shape.
Like your shirt there, too.
Thank you. Thank you. I got
Very
4 of this exact same
Very
one.
appropriate for the meeting today.
Got the uniform on. It's what I wear every day. Yeah.
Right?
Like 15 of these things.
Yeah, you don't have to wash that often.
That's right. Exactly. I can go a couple weeks without doing laundry. It's perfect.
Right.
All right. Looks like we're starting to see some people pop in. It's good.
Great. We probably should get started.
All right.
Yep.
Sounds
It's,
good, dude.
A few minutes after 4. Caitlin, can you open it up for everybody?
It's open up for everyone.
Oh, we're ready?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Gibbons. I'm with Advizex. I'm part of the management team, sales management team, that is, within the organization. And we want to thank you all for being here today. We have some real good, exciting information to share with you about Tanium. Tanium is one of our top partners. They're certainly best of breed in what they do. And we're real anxious to share the Tanium platform with you today. So with us, we have John Quinn, who is our partner development manager with Tanium. We also have Eric Arnst, who is the technical development manager within Tanium. And then for the whiskey tasting portion, we have PJ from Local 3, who will be presenting towards the end. So again, we really appreciate you guys and ladies being here. You know, the objective for today is to just, again, give you an overview of the Tanium platform and really see how it can impact your environments. So afterwards, after you hear the presentation, we'd like your feedback and then be able to follow up with you to see how we can talk about some of the further discussions with you and your team. So I'm going to turn this over to John Quinn. John is, again, the Tanium Partner Development Manager. We like to refer to John as the Reverend. And it's not because of his religious beliefs, but it's because of the passion and the knowledge and the experience he has within the industry as well as with Tanium. So John, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. Also want to say thanks to the whole Advizex team for a great partnership and all the investments that you've made in understanding Tanium and really how to support your customers' needs with this platform. What I want to do real quick in terms of just some housekeeping for everybody, we have, this is set up where you are muted. And we want to make sure that we do create some dialogue. So, we can kind of gain some knowledge about maybe where your interests lie as we go. So please use the chat, use the Q&A, whichever you're more comfortable with. Myself, Jamie, Eric, we'll all see those things. We'll make sure the questions get answered. Our technical expert today, Eric Arnst, by the way, who does come from a customer environment. So he's been in your shoes. Eric knows the challenges that you're faced with day in and day out. He loves that dialogue. So I feel like I've let Eric down a little bit by not creating that live environment. So please, please, please make me look good and light up the chat, light up the Q&A so that Eric's got something to respond to. Let's face it, everyone that's here, a big part of why you're here is because of what PJ sent from Local 3. So everybody hopefully has their kits from Local 3, and we'll get to PJ to you as quickly as we can. The good news is there are no slides. We're going to go right into what the platform looks like and really help you understand Tanium. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our technical solutions engineer, Eric Arnst. And Eric is going to really be the guy that elevates your expectations of what's possible when it comes to IT visibility and control by showing you the Tanium platform, giving you a sense of what that world looks like for our customers today. So with that, Eric, let me pass it to you.
Great. Thanks, John. And thanks everybody for joining us today. Let me get my screen shared out here so we can look at something other than my big head as we talk through just some introductions. Let me give you a little bit of background on myself. My name is Eric Arnst. I am a technical account manager with Tanium. I'm based out of Tampa, Florida. I've been with Tanium about 3 years now. And as John mentioned, I was actually a customer of Tanium for about 1.5 years before that, where I brought it into my organization, where I was Director of Information Security. And again, as John said, I just want to strongly emphasize, I really do like to have questions as we're going through this. And normally it'd be a dialogue and I'd be asking you questions and we could be talking about what you're seeing here. But I've watched this demo from your chair, right? I've watched this demo and I remember being full of questions. I was also pretty highly skeptical and thinking like, there's no way that's possible. If you have that thought, I'd love for you to pop a question into chat and we can at least engage in that way. And just to give you a very quick history of Tanium, just so you know what we're about and where we're coming from. I'll tell you that Tanium was started about 13 years ago because we found that most organizations, even the largest and most well-funded organizations, have major challenges with the visibility and control of their IT assets. Right? When it comes right down to it, they just really didn't even know what they have. They don't know who's using them. They don't know if they're vulnerable. And all of these things over time become something that adds up and becomes very difficult to fix. You can think of it as just a basic IT hygiene, right? Think about it as knowing what patches are applied. Think about it as where are there compliance issues or integrity monitoring issues, right? These things are all very important, but as a company scales, it just becomes very difficult to keep your arms wrapped around that. To the point that we'll go into a new prospect and say, hey, how many machines do you have? We'll get answers that vary widely. They'll tell us, we have somewhere between 20 and 25,000 machines. But that's a major delta. That's a major delta. And so what Tanium has done is created a protocol and an architecture that allows us to go find those machines, to be able to say definitively how many machines you have. And it doesn't matter if it's cloud-based, or if it's on-prem, Windows, Mac, Linux, it doesn't matter. We're going to be able to find those things, and we're going to help you to get your arms wrapped around that. Because beyond that, right, all things in IT are reliant on at least having that basic inventory and that basic visibility that, again, is very difficult to do. So let me jump in here, and we'll actually start clicking some of these buttons, and I'll show you the interesting stuff in this. Before we really start clicking, I will also tell you, though, Tanium is very much a platform, right? There's really two things I hope to leave you with today. And I'll also say we are going to be hustling through this demo, right? We got a limited amount of time because I don't want to stand between you and whiskey, right? And so I just want to give you a sense of what we're about, and hopefully something in this presentation piques your interest. And I'd love to follow up with you and dive into your specific use cases and how we can make Tanium fit in your environment. But the two things I hope to leave you with, one, Tanium is very much a platform that can do both operations and security use cases. We're really the only platform that's doing both operations and security use cases, which means we can both do the patching and the software distribution and the asset discovery, but we can also do the incident response and compliance checking and vulnerability management. And what that means for your organization then is that you can consolidate tools. You can make it to where you are reducing the complexity in your environment. So you're not having to deal with all of these different support models and all of this different infrastructure and you know, these major gaps between teams with their disparate data. Instead, you're bringing it onto a single platform, and it just makes a lot of sense to do that, right? And the second thing that I hope to leave you with is the real-time nature in which Tanium can go out and get this information. So that's where I'll start clicking, right? This is where it gets interesting. This is also where I got skeptical, right? When I was watching this demo. So I want you to ask questions if you have any questions at all about how this is even possible, because it does seem rather hard to believe. And we'll talk about how it's possible before we get to the end of this as well. But what this amounts to is we can go and ask just natural language questions of all of the endpoints in the environment. So that might look like this. Maybe I want to get the computer name, the IP address, maybe the operating system. We'll let my typos ride there, and you know, you can just kind of string these things together. What else do we want to get? Maybe CPU details, right? So Tanium's going to translate what it is that I tried to type up there into what it knows how to go out and get, and it's going to go out in real time to all of the machines in our environment, and it's going to ask them, what's your computer name? What's your IP address? Right? What's your operating system? Tell me about your CPU details. And the major difference between this and anything else is that when I click that button, Tanium is going out in real time. It's actually polling those machines and pulling this data, which means it's not pulling it from a database. It's not pulling it from some otherwise pre-cached source of information. It's pulling it live, which means that we know this is reliable information, right? Compare this to what you might be used to, where I'm not going to pick on any particular tool. This is true of all of them, but let me just, for the sake of conversation, if you're getting this out of an SCCM or a Big Fix or something like that, they can provide this type of data, but they're pulling it from a database where those machines may have not checked in a couple hours or a couple days, maybe even a couple weeks. You're certainly dealing with stale data. And with Tanium, that is just not the case, right? We know for sure, because we've just asked those machines, that this is reliable, high fidelity information. And the other thing here is, you know, this is a pretty static set of data, but what if we wanted to get something a little bit more dynamic? What if we wanted to go say, get the installed application? Maybe you want an application list of all of your machines, and maybe it's not all of them. Maybe you only want it from all the machines with a Windows operating system, right? So in this case, Tanium is going to say, are you a Windows operating system? If yes, what do you have installed? And so if you think about this, it's as if you were looking at one machine, at its add remove programs and figuring out what's there, but then being able to do it synchronously across all of the machines in your environment and pulling back the aggregate results here, where you're getting a count, you're getting a list of the number of the version and the number of machines that have that particular piece of software on it. And really, it's not even just about finding it this quickly. We can actually take action on this as well. So like this Dropbox always catches my eye in our demo environment. There's Dropbox on 16 machines. Well, let's say Dropbox is not allowed in the corporate environment. I can actually just select that one, deploy an action, and tell it to uninstall that MSI, right? And as quickly as what we just found that information, which was all of about 15 seconds, those 16 machines will start uninstalling Dropbox, and they'll no longer have it anymore. And we can actually reissue that command. We can just say, hey, every hour, maybe let's be more aggressive with it. Every 15 minutes, go out and ask all the machines, do you have Dropbox installed? If yes, run this uninstall script. So we've now automated away that task. Don't even have to think about that one anymore. And after having used Tanium for a little over 4 years now in total, I had this kind of epiphany the other day where what this boils down to is being able to go out and pull all of your machines in real time and find those machines that are in an undesirable state. And that could be any number of things, right? It could be this case where it's got software that shouldn't be there. It may be that there's a registry key that's not set that should be, or maybe a service is stopped that should be running. It's anything. Go find a machine in an undesirable state and then run a little script to bring it into a more desirable state. And this also just boils down to that IT hygiene, right? It's the basic blocking and tackling that becomes very difficult to do at scale. And Tanium does it exceedingly well, right? That's what this really comes down to. It's that power to go out and pull information from endpoints in real time and then fix it and then take action. That is what differentiates Tanium versus anything else. And it's with that power that we've been able to build all of these different modules, right? All of these squares represent a module that can, again, replace a point solution in your environment. It can reduce the complexity of your environment. And quite honestly, we can do these better and faster than that point solution, right? Those incumbent solutions that you may be using today because of that real-time nature of what we're doing.
Hey, Eric, a question came in from James. Just, I think it's a good place to kind of insert it. Just in terms of the agent that we're running on the client machines. You talk about all these different modules and all this capability. I think it's important to just explain kind of what it is that we're doing on the endpoint to be able to get this back, get this information back.
Sure. Yeah, and I assume we're asking from like the agent perspective. How's the agent operating? And
we're going to have to assume at this point because I can't,
okay.
All I have is a clarification that it's agent based on the client machines.
Okay, yeah, so it is agent based. The agent is super lightweight, and we can talk more about that if need be. Oh, and I am seeing chat. Okay, cool, awesome. Yeah, so it is agent based. It is absolutely agent based, and I want to talk about how that agent is working, right? Because I think I told you guys I was a network engineer for most of my career. When I saw that functionality, when I was watching this demo from your chair, I was thinking to myself, you must be crushing the network, right? If that's real, if you're actually going out to all of the endpoints in real time, you must be crushing the network. And let's talk about how we're not. Let's talk about how Tanium is different, right? So I'm going to flip over to an architecture that is going to be able to describe the real magic of what Tanium's doing, the real secret sauce here. And I'll tell you, it's not this. This is actually how every other agent-based tool since the beginning of time, right? This is how like the SCCMs work. This is how BigFix works. Again, pretty much every other agent-based tool ever operates in this hub and spoke way of doing things. And quite honestly, this is what Tanium set out to solve. Because if you've seen the history of Tanium, and I failed to mention it up front, but the guys who created Tanium first created a product called BigFix. And they ended up selling that to IBM. And when they looked back on it, they said, BigFix was pretty good for its time, right? This worked well 15 or 20 years ago, but it just doesn't scale in today's world. You need more and more of these relay servers in order to really scale this out, each of which has a cost, has an administrative overhead, has a security risk. There's a lot of WAN traffic here. Anyways, I won't belabor the point, but this is what Tanium set out to solve. And we did so by getting rid of those relay servers. We actually spent about 5 years in development, from 2007 to 2012. Before we even had a viable product, we were coming up with how can we make this better? And what we came up with is this. So this is the magic of Tanium. This is the thing that allows us to scale massively on minimal infrastructure without bogging down networks. And I'll explain briefly how this works. So this chain of machines over here, that's a single subnet. We call it the linear chain. That's the term in our patent. But the way that works then is that when I'm asking that question of get computer name from all machines, I'm not having to ask that individually of every single machine. as would have been the case up here, right? As would have been the case in this old school way of doing it, where you literally would have to ask every machine. But this is all I knew. This is all anyone knew, which is why I thought you must be bogging down the network if you're asking that actually live in real time. With Tanium, we're not asking every machine individually. Instead, we're asking it one time per subnet, which should be a much, much smaller number, right? And so when I'm asking that question of get computer name, I'm having to ask it one time, and then it's saying, what's your computer name, what's your computer name, what's your computer name, until those aggregate answers come back to the Tanium server. And again, it's all happening out here at the LAN, right? It's happening where there's lots of bandwidth and things happen very quickly. And this becomes even more pronounced if we're talking about pushing a patch or pushing a big software package. Think of it like the Windows 10 feature update. That's like 3 or 4 gigs, right? In the old school way, you would have had to have pushed that to every single machine or to a distribution point and then to every single machine. When Tanium is pushing out that package, we push it one time to the subnet, and then they are actually going to share it amongst themselves, and each of them are going to cache a little bit of that package so that if a new machine comes online and says, hey, I need patch number 12, it's not going to have to reach back over your WAN link and go get it from that central server. It's just going to reconstitute it from its buddies out here where, again, bandwidth is fast and plentiful. So that's the thing that really differentiates Tanium versus everything else. It's also worth noting that we can throw a server out here in the DMZ, and there's no directionality arrows here, but these machines are actually checking into Tanium, which means there could be a machine that's just out at Starbucks. They're not on your VPN. They're just opened up their laptop to check their email, and they're going to check in and they're going to go, hey, Tanium, what do you have for me? We're going to say, run this patch, or what's your compliance level, or what's your installed applications. And we're going to be able to maintain that visibility even when things are off net. And one last note here, we can also host all of this for you, right? There's very minimal infrastructure. Like even our biggest of customers that have upwards of 1 million endpoints are running on essentially one server. They usually build out a second one for HA, and then they build out what they call a module server. But compare that to the literally hundreds of SCCM distribution points that they had previously. But again, we can also do this completely serverless, and we'll host it for you. We call that PaaS, or Tanium as a Service. So normally this is a place where I'd love to break for questions. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them in chat. But again, this is the thing that allows Tanium to do what it does. And when it comes right down to it, other solutions can do the things that Tanium is doing. They just can't do it as fast, they can't do it as reliably, and they can't do it at the scale that Tanium is because they don't have this, right? And it's also the kind of thing that we love to talk about it because it is such a differentiator, but you don't actually have to think about this. If you became a Tanium customer tomorrow, you just install the agent and Tanium handles all of this for you. Just know there's major efficiencies happening behind the scenes that really lend themselves to that visibility that is difficult for most organizations. Again, I told you I'm going to hustle a little bit, so I want to cover a couple of key things here. The one is that visibility around asset discovery, right? That knowing how many endpoints you actually have, and knowing beyond saying we have somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500, right? But having a much better picture of what that is. And when I became a customer of Tanium, this is pretty much the reason I brought it in, along with the patching situation. But it was to the point where when I took the job, I was asking my team, how many endpoints do we need to secure? And I got answers that were all over the place. They'd go, well, if you go ask Qualys, you get one answer, and go to Active Directory, you get another answer, and ServiceNow has a different list. Take all those, divide by 3, and that's about how many we have. But that wasn't an acceptable answer for me, right? If we're trying to secure things, we need to know what all is out there. The way Tanium goes out and finds those things is with this Discover module, but even beyond clicking into the module, and I can show you what it ends up looking like, but more importantly, it's how it gets that information. I'm going to click back over to my diagram here because this is a very uniquely Tanium way in which we go out and find things. So I told you this is a single subnet, right? And so if you were to become a Tanium customer tomorrow, we would say as a first pass, in order to get that Tanium agent out there, use whatever your incumbent software distribution is, right? Let's keep talking SCCM since that's what we've been talking so far. So you're going to build that package in SCCM. You're going to push it out to everything. It's not particularly quick, so you're going to wait a couple of days or maybe a week, and you're going to come back and go, all right, SCCM says you got it. We got it on everything. And so once we go in there and look with this discovery mechanism that I'm about to describe to you, I can almost guarantee you, just based on all of the deployments that I've done, that you will have gotten that agent on between 80 and 85% of your machines, which means there was 15 to 20% of the machines that in some way had fallen outside of your administrative control. right? And this can happen for any number of reasons. Maybe the disk was filled up. Maybe the SCCM agent was broken, or WMI was having problems, or maybe somebody used an image that wasn't your standard image. The list goes on and on. There's all sorts of reasons as to why that machine may have been a bit invisible to you, but was still online. With Tanium, we're going to take those 80 to 85% of the machines that you were able to get the agent on, and we're going to turn them into little mini scanners on the subnet. So like if that one's .10 and that one's .15, we can have .10 scan 11, 12, 13, 14, and figure out if there's anything there. And I guarantee you, there is going to be things there. There's going to be lots of things. There's going to be things like printers and IP phones and IP cameras and routers and switches and these things that don't even accommodate a Tanium agent, but at least you know they're there. But we're also going to find a lot of things that probably should have been getting managed. There's these Windows devices or Linux devices or any of these endpoint-like devices, both workstations and servers, that again have just fallen outside of your administrative control in one way or another. And we're going to bring those under management. We're going to put a Tanium agent on them, and we're going to shore up that blind spot. And then the second piece of this is that, as I'm sure everybody's aware, most agent-based tools have this problem where they just stop checking in sometimes. And again, any number of reasons, and quite honestly, Tanium's not immune to that, right? Some of those things on that list that I mentioned before, like the disk filling up, are purely environmental things that we have no control over. The way Tanium combats that, right? The way Tanium overcomes that problem is that in addition to scanning the white space out here, we're also going to make these machines play neighborhood watch, which means we can have .10 tell us, hey, I still see that MAC address of .15. It's still online. It's just no longer answering my questions, and somebody needs to check that out. So compare that to pretty much any other agent-based tool where when it stops checking in, you just kind of don't know until you don't know, until you put some kind of manual intervention in there, and you have to do that in order to determine, is it broken or has it been decommissioned, right? Is it turned off? And it's very hard to discern between those. With Tanium, you will absolutely know and can be alerted proactively. So through that discovery process, that two-pronged approach of scan the white space and play neighborhood watch, we're going to be very comprehensive in deployment of that Tanium agent, which of course makes all of these other things better, right? Like, of course, your patching is made better if you actually know where all the machines are and can know for sure that the agents are working, right? Of course, your compliance and vulnerability management is going to be more complete if you know where all the machines are. So that's so fundamental to everything else, not just Tanium, but in IT. And it's the thing that most organizations struggle with, and it gets harder and harder the more machines we add in there. So again, that is the basic IT hygiene and visibility that Tanium can bring. And believe me, that's just scratching the surface here. Like we are going to talk about hopefully at least one more of these modules, but I'm going to be hustling a little bit. I'm not going to be able to do this justice, right? But I do want to talk about how Tanium can make your patching situation significantly better. And we'll just run through that quickly. But again, if any of this piques your interest, love a follow-up. I'd love to be able to deep dive with you on any of these. And it's also worth noting that I'm going to be talking patching. This very well could be vulnerability management. It very well could be security. My favorite module is threat response, but I brought in Tanium for patching initially. I had to work with my operations team, and it was because our patching situation was pretty atrocious. It was a pretty bad situation, and I really didn't even see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I thought they were just bad at patching, but as it turns out, the tool that they were using was just not allowing them to get there. Like literally, they were having to babysit the agent and stay up with it during patch windows just to make sure that it was up and operational, because I was leaning on them hard to get patching done. But once we brought in Tanium, they just had much better visibility. This worked much better. And probably as important as the actual functionality was the fact that my security team was in here looking at the vulnerability management, and they were in here, the operations team was in here doing patching. We were looking at that same platform, and it made things much more harmonious between those teams, because quite honestly, those vulnerability management calls could get a little bit contentious otherwise, right? It'd be like, hey, Qualys saying you didn't patch your thing. And they'd say, well, Big Fix, I told you the tool, but they said, well, Big Fix says I did patch my thing. And sometimes they were right, and sometimes I was right. Didn't really matter. It wasn't conducive to actually fixing the problem. The way that Tanium is going to get your patching to a 99+% is through a series of things. And I'll be honest with you, especially at when we get to talk one-on-one in a follow-up, I would probably ask, what does your patching efficacy look like today, right? And I'm asking at the end of the month, it's the day before Microsoft Patch Tuesday. What is SCCM, what is Big Fix, what is Altiris telling you is the percentage of patches that have gotten out there? And almost without fail, when I ask that question, I hear it's somewhere between 90 and 95%. So funny to me, like almost every time, it's somewhere between 90 and 95%. But what we find is it's 90 to 95% of the 80 to 85% of machines they actually knew about, right? And so their number actually is much lower than what they thought it was. The way Tanium makes this better is that, first of all, we've now discovered everything, right? We've discovered all your machines. We actually have a different way of doing patch applicability checking, where we take the entire Microsoft offline cab file and we pass it to the endpoint. And this is a listing of every security release Microsoft has ever put out for any of their products. And because we're so fast and efficient at talking to endpoints, we can pass that to the endpoint and say, scan yourself against this. It becomes a much better way to go find what patches are out there. And then, of course, the distribution of the patches is going through that Tanium architecture. And then finally, there is the Tanium's ability to actually surface any errors that happen during that patching through the console here. Much different than other tools where you just kind of don't know when that patching failed. So again, I mean, this is talking quickly through it, and really there's all sorts of other benefits here, and it's all the things that you would expect to include much better reporting than what you're probably used to. And as I wrap up here, I'll click into some of that reporting just so you can get a look at what might be possible, because normally, again, and I told you, I've watched this demo. Normally, we find that this is kind of hard to believe, right? It's so different than what folks are used to seeing that it just is something that you go, man, how can that be real? A normally logical next step for us after we learn about your environment and make sure Tanium's a good fit is to bring Tanium in and let us show you, right? Let us show you what this looks like in a POC or a production pilot, because these types of graphs are something that is always very telling in those production pilots, right? Something like this graph here that says, how many machines do we have that have patches that are older than 30 days are missing? And normally when we go in, it looks a little bit like this, right? It looks like this level of compliance, maybe a little better. Our demo environment probably could be patched a little better. And we can also look at this as more of a histograph. Like, what does that look like over the last 30 days? But this is where there is a distinct before and after picture where I could pretty much draw a line on this and say, that's where Tanium started patching in your POC environment, in your environment, because we're going to watch that green go up to the top without fail. And I'd love to be able to come in and show you that. And so, again, this was like the super hustle through it demo. Hopefully it piqued your interest, but I'm going to kind of start to wrap up here so we can do some whiskey, right? And I'll just kind of wrap where I started in saying Tanium is a platform. It's very much a platform that can do both operations and security use cases. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing, right? It's modularized in such a way that it makes a lot of sense to bring Tanium in for a particular use case. Like I said, for me, that was asset discovery and patching. But then as my renewals came due, I started plugging in other modules. I said, well, maybe as my quals comes up, I'll plug in comply. As Tripwire came up, I plugged in integrity monitor, right? I had an EDR solution that I ended up putting threat response in. And so for me, that reduced the complexity. It made it to where I didn't have to assign expertise and say, okay, you're my McAfee guy, and you're my Tripwire guy, you're my Qualys guy, right? Instead, I just had them all in the same platform, and it made my team's life much, much easier. And I'm hoping that we can talk to you and do the same for you as well. So, John, I'll break there. And,
okay. Very good.
Anything else I need to cover, let me know. Otherwise, I'll start my screen share.
We'll keep a quick eye on the chat here as we close out. I did put into the chat window for everybody a link. We do actually have kind of the opportunity for you to go and spin up from the Tanium as a service instance, your own instance to try internally in your environment. So you can use that link to go there and check it out. It actually is quite intuitive. It's a well done platform. The other thing, I guess, Eric, before we hand it over to PJ, One of the things a lot of times people come forward with is this challenge of software renewals, license renewals in terms of their organizations. They get told by the vendor what they need to be buying. What's been your experience in those situations where people end up realizing how many instances of licenses that they were purchasing that they didn't need?
Yeah, that's a good one. And I'll say it's very difficult to stand up against that audit that says you owe us X amount of dollars because you have X amount of copies of our software installed if you don't even know how many machines you have, right? It's very tough to have a leg to stand on in that case. The same exact thing happened to me as I was doing a POC of Tanium, where the procurement lady that I worked with often came to me and said, she got wind of the fact we had Tanium, but she said, Eric, can you tell me how many machines have Visio in project installed, but they haven't used it in 60 days? I said, absolutely, Joanne, let me get that for you. And we ended up uninstalling those pieces of software and saved about $250K in the first year of using Tanium, just on software license reclamation. I didn't even include that in my initial ROI. It wasn't something I considered, but it was a really big deal, and it was a big boon for us with Tanium.
Yeah, it's one of those little things that a lot of times we just overlook. We take for granted that, well, that's the number and that's what we've got to do, not realizing that we don't even know how often that application is being used and whether or not it's something that that's really supporting the organization at the price we're paying for it. So, all right, very good. Well, I would like to go ahead. We will be on to listen to PJ and his expertise, but available to respond to any Q&As, folks. So, but PJ, I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to you to take over and get these folks their cocktail. It's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Sounds good. So welcome, guys. As we mentioned, my name's PJ Schlondrop. I'm the local bourbon sommelier here at Local 3 in Atlanta, Georgia. We're going to be going through an age statement tasting today for you guys. Advizex picked some really nice things so that you can get a little bit of a taste through some of the few existing age statements in the bourbon world. A little bit about bourbon. First things first, right now is a good time to bust open that Manhattan. The idea there is to have a little bit of a cocktail as an icebreaker. But while you're getting everything set up, if you're going to go follow along with me for the tasting, I would encourage you to get a couple different tasting glasses. I have traditional Glencairns, which you'll see here, which are kind of standard for tasting. But if you're going to use a rocks glass or a mason jar or a tin cup, all of these are acceptable. If you do want to do the tasting as you would normally do in a in-person setting, I would encourage a couple different glasses so you can go back and forth and taste these. But a little bit about bourbon. Bourbon kind of derives its name from the French Bourbon dynasty. It didn't start getting used in society until about the mid-1800s, but it is classified as one of America's staple spirits. As I mentioned earlier, the age statement is what we're going to be doing today. There's not a lot of age statements out there in bourbon. It's kind of lost its following, if you will, a few years back, whereas Scotch kind of has an age statement to tell you exactly what you're getting. Bourbon is more about year to year. The few that we're working with have started coming back with age statements just because it is something that some people do want to kind of focus on. It's something that's a little bit more unique. So the ones that we're going to be going through today are those. In order to be considered a bourbon, a couple things have to be a requirement. It does have to be 51% corn or higher. You will have a variation of wheat, malted barley, and rye, depending on the distiller. But that 51% corn is a mandate. It is barreled at no higher than 160 proof, and it is bottled at no lower than 40% or 80 proof. It is going to be aged in new oak barrels. That is a requirement as well. So they will not be reusing barrels in making bourbon. It's a one and done kind of thing. And then from there, you have a couple different smaller subcategories, things that are called bottled in bond, which are a little bit more highly regulated. Before bourbon had any regulations, there was nothing that really kept it in check up until 1897, when a lot of bourbon distillers came together and had the Bottled and Bond Act passed, which mandated what was going to come out of the barrel. That has to be aged for upwards to 4 years or higher in order to be a bottled and bond, and it's going to be bottled at 100 proof or 50% ABV. So there's a couple different variances there that kind of make for what a bottled and bond is versus what a traditional bourbon is. First and foremost, though, with that Manhattan, you're going to be enjoying Russell's Reserve. This is their 10-year edition. Russell's is out of Russell's is out of Wild Turkey. And their 10-year production is going to be a really more high rye. So that's why we use this for a Manhattan. I tend to find that Manhattans run really well with rye whiskeys. But since we're doing an age statement, we picked a high rye bourbon for this. So you'll notice that there's a couple things that we're going to be looking at in tastings. Color is, of course, one of those things. The nose or the scent of the bourbon is the second. The taste, obviously, and then the finish of that bourbon. These are going to be the 4 kind of bullet points that you want to go through in a tasting. Obviously, you're not going to be looking at these things for the Russells, just because it's been turned into that Manhattan. But a little bit of a history about Manhattans. They were invented in the mid-1800s at the Manhattan Club in Manhattan, and it became such a popular drink that it made its way into the classic cocktail world. As I mentioned earlier, rye whiskeys and high rye bourbons tend to be the best ones for that because it kind of accents the flavor, but you can make a Manhattan out of any whiskey or bourbon or rye whiskey that suits you. The order that we're going to be going in today is we're going to be starting with the Bibb & Tucker 12-year. We're going to be moving into the Bullet 10-year. After that is the Henry Mckenna 10-year, and then finishing up with the Knob Creek 12-year. So like I mentioned, there's 4 things that we're going to be looking at is color, nose, taste, and finish. So for that Bibb & Tucker, you obviously can't really get a good view of the color on this because of the bottling. Bibb & Tucker is owned by a Tennessee whiskey family called the Deutsch family. They bought this back in 2017. They have not changed the recipe from the original recipe that is about 150 years or so, which is why they keep the bottling the same way as well. The idea here is they want to kind of go with that old school bourbon making look. So you have your traditional dark bottle here. But when you take a look at it, you're going to see that it's got kind of an orangey, vibrant tint to it, almost like a pale gold color. Depending on the aging process can depend on how long, or can depend on how dark that may be. So since most of these are a longer aging process, you can sometimes see a little bit more color with this. The one differentiating thing with Bibb & Tucker versus the others as to why the color is a little more goldish than it is more copper is because they only use a #1 charring on the inside of those American oak barrels, which is on the lighter side for the charring that you'll find with bourbons. So that is why this one tends to be lighter. It's also why I chose this one to start with, because it is the lighter of the 4. You should always kind of start from the bottom and work your way up. But if you give it a little bit of a sniff, it's got some standard notes. You can get some vanilla, you get a little bit of caramel. I kind of get some citrus, almost like lemon with that. In the way of the taste, it definitely has a kick to it. It is a higher proof. I believe it's at like 107.3. So it's a little bit higher than you would traditionally find. As I mentioned, bourbons are kind of 40% is their baseline. So this is up there. And then it kind of lingers on the palate because of that higher octane. The 12-year is definitely more of like a put on your fine clothes compared to the 6-year, which is a little bit more softer and a little bit more subtle. So I definitely prefer this over the 6-year. But again, age statement in bourbon does not necessarily mean that it's better. It does mean that there has been a little bit more time put into the bourbon, but being that it's a 25-year-old bourbon doesn't necessarily mean it's a better bourbon like you would expect for Scotch. I know you guys are not really back and forth. So I'm just going to kind of keep rambling on about things. If you have questions, though, the Q&A is open, so feel free to type those in, ask me any of those. But moving on through, it is definitely a higher one, a higher proof. It's very subtle, though, for that higher proof, which is nice considering. But yeah, moving on, we're going to be looking at Bulleit 10-year. Bulleit, I'm sure, is one that we are all familiar with. We've seen it in bars, you've seen it in airports, you've seen it almost everywhere. The 10-year is not going to be as more easily sourced. It does take a little bit more time. The traditional Bulleit you find in most every bar is going to be aged anywhere between 5 and 8 years, depending on environment and where it is in the warehousing and things of that. But they do make sure to make a point of doing the 10-year at a 10-year mark. Thomas E. Bulleit Jr. was the original creator of Bulleit. It is one of those few surviving whiskey distillers that have been around pre and post prohibition. So they are one of the bigger names in bourbon, which is why it's a little bit more easier for you to find them, because they have some of the larger warehouses out in Kentucky. So Bibb and Tucker, as I mentioned, was a Tennessee whiskey. This is a Kentucky whiskey. Generally speaking, 95% or so bourbons will be from Kentucky. It is not a requirement to be considered a bourbon to be from Kentucky, but that is kind of where they all come from, because you have that really clean, crisp water, the nice limestone distillation process that naturally occurs in Kentucky. So that's why a lot of the bourbons out and about are going to be from Kentucky, but it is not a requirement in order to be a bourbon. So this one, it's about 68% corn, so it's going to be on the sweeter side. It's definitely higher in proof than the original one that we looked at. I believe this one's over at about 118 proof, 45.6, so 91.2 proof, so a little bit lower, but still on the sweeter side because of the higher corn content with that. Giving it a little bit of a smell, you've got, it's lighter, it's definitely inoffensive, whereas the higher alcohol ones can kind of be in your face. It's got a woody scent to it. It is on the lighter side in color. I would say more like ochre or perhaps, you know, kind of clay. In the way of taste, it is sweeter. It has a slighter edge to it, but it is smooth. I get vanilla notes, a little bit of cinnamon. I can definitely taste the rye in this one compared to the original one, just because I think they use up to about like 25, 28% rye for this particular one. And then it does have a nice finish. It's a little more nasally. You can taste it on the back of the throat. You get the wood taste that you kind of get in the scent there. But it's got a really nice, clean finish with just a hint of sweetness on the end, which is why, you know, Bulleit's one of those that is very all-encompassing. Lots of people like it. It makes great cocktails. It can be found everywhere because it has a very approachable flavor profile. If we find that these bourbons are a little bit hot for you guys, I, of course, do this all the time. I'm used to bourbon. I tend to drink my bourbon straight. If all you're getting is ethanol, if all you're getting is the heat, feel free to add a couple ice cubes. Feel free to add a little bit of water. Obviously, bourbon does have water added into it because it does not come out of the barrels at 40 proof or 40%. It comes out much higher, and then the master distillers will be adding water to this to get it down to the flavor profile that they want. So don't feel discouraged. Definitely add some water to it if it's a little hot for you. But if you want to drink it as it comes, that is always the way I would encourage you to do it. But you know, it's a very subjective thing here. We're kind of tasting a lot of different things to figure out what we like, what we don't like, how we like it, how we don't like it. So no way of doing this is wrong. moving on forward, everybody doing all right? Do we have questions? We'll need the Manhattan recipe if you can share. Absolutely. It's a pretty basic Manhattan recipe. The one that we use here at Local 3 is kind of our standard one. So you're going to be looking at 2 ounces of whatever bourbon you feel like. It's 0.75 ounces of whatever vermouth you feel like. We use Carpana Antica just because it's a nice cleaner one. And then I use 3 dashes of Angostura bitters. And a cherry on top. The difference is that cherry is a brandy soaked cherry. I think that kind of gives it a little something extra, but you can use any maraschino cherries or any standard cocktail cherry. In the way of Scotch versus bourbon, personally, I'm a Scotch fan because Scotch is delicious, but it is an acquired taste. The peat and the smoke are something that a lot of whiskey drinkers tend to have to kind of either get past or deal with, if you will. But that is kind of what I feel is the feature in Scotch. Scotch is definitely also going to be a lot different in flavor profiles because you have a lot of different regions imparting their regional flavors with the water, with the peat, with the smoke. So Scotch is kind of like a step up in the whiskey game. It is very, very unique. There's a lot of things going on. There's hundreds of year-old recipes, just as there is with bourbon, but I feel like bourbon is a little bit more approachable than Scotch is. So if you're just getting into whiskey, if you're just starting to like figure it out, bourbon's the way to go because it's definitely more approachable than Scotch, and it's going to be a lot easier to find. Not to mention, Scotch can run you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, whereas bourbon will run you tens of dollars, maybe $100 on a really good bottle. So again, if you're just getting started on whiskey, bourbon's the way to go for sure. So on that note, kind of a segue from Scotch into bourbon, we have Henry Mckenna. Henry Mckenna is a name for the Irish immigrant who they have the family recipe of. So it's done kind of in the sense of, it's kind of done in the way of a traditional Scotch. But it is a bourbon. It is a bottled and bond bourbon, as we mentioned. So this is always going to be barreled at 100 proof. It has been aged for at least 4 years. This is obviously the 10-year. Because we mentioned earlier we're doing the age statement for this. So it is one of the longest aged bourbons out there. It's aged for 40 seasons. And it is one of the oldest bourbon recipes out there as well. Like I said, they've got a family recipe that was carried over by Irish immigrants. So it really does have its place in the bourbon world. So you'll notice this one's got a little bit more of a warm amber color to it, whereas if you look back on, say for instance, the Big and Tucker or the Bullet, there's kind of a different color profile to this. So a lot softer, a lot more amber. It definitely has warmer notes, more vanilla, almost like some herbaceousness to it. So think like grassier notes. I think that comes from the cleaner process that they use for this. In the way of the taste, it's definitely smoother. I get sharper spice notes. So more like, baking spices. It's got a sweetness to it, kind of, almost a honey profile. It definitely has a long kind of taste in your mouth. It lingers for a really long time. You keep the sweet notes, you keep the spicy notes. It's not heavy. It doesn't hit you in the face like some of the higher ABV ones, but it still does kind of hang out for a very long time. Henry Mckenna is one of my favorites for sure. Like I said, they've been around for a hot minute. 1855 is what they have their stamp of approval on the bottle for. So definitely one to add to your collection, especially if you're looking for something in between your bourbon and your Scotch. Let's see, looking at some of these questions here. I understand why people like Scotch, but I prefer bourbon. Like I said, it's all subjective. You know, Scotch is definitely one of those that takes a little bit more getting used to. Bourbon is definitely more approachable. But it all just depends on what you like. And that's why these things are fun, because you can taste a couple things that you don't have to go out and spend $100 on a bottle for, and kind of figure out if you like, you know, Bullet versus High West, or High West versus Michter's, or Michter's versus Four Roses. So really great ways to go about it with this. Am I going too fast for anyone? Everybody doing all right? I'll kind of answer your guys' questions as we go through things, but moving on, we are finishing up with Knob Creek. If we are familiar with Jim Beam Suntory, this is one of their 4 small select batches. They have one named Basil Hayden, they have Booker's, they have Baker's, and then of course Knob Creek. So this is kind of like Jim Beam's step up the ladder for some of their higher select things. They have been doing this since about 1992. That was when their international release with Knob Creek started. And they have a couple different age statements. They have a 9-year age statement, they have a 12-year age statement, and a 15-year age statement. Again, as I mentioned, you don't see a lot of age statements in bourbon, because the idea with bourbon is you're not really going for a set age, you're going for a set flavor. So if it was a drier year, or a wetter year, or a hotter year, or a cooler year, those can kind of speed things up or slow things down in the aging process. But some people, or some master distillers, do want to have a set age statement on it, which is where you see some of these. It is more of a rare thing to find, but it is a cool thing to find. And if you want to, you know, kind of amass a large collection of bourbon and have a lot of different things across a lot of different flavor profiles, age statements are a really great way to kind of give you an idea of some different things here. So this one is 100 proof, just like the bottled in bond. It is not a bottled in bond because they didn't kind of go through those profiles to meet those requirements, but it is still an absolutely amazing bourbon. It's a little bit darker, in my opinion, than some of the previous ones. I feel like as we go down, or as we go up through the progression, we're kind of going down in the darkness. So it's almost like an old copper or a bronze color to me, but it definitely has a lot more going on, because it has 2 more years on the age statement than the others that we've gone through. So that can impart some of those colors. They do a number 4 char on the barreling with this, which is the darkest of the chars that you'll see. It's called an alligator char, because after 55 seconds of charring the inside of that barrel, it starts to look like alligator skin. So, you know, being pretty literal here, that is why they call it a number 4 alligator char. So we'll take a little sniff on that. It definitely has some toasted oak notes. You can kind of almost smell the smoke from the inside of that. It definitely has a lot more ethanol than, say, for instance, the Mckenna. The Mckenna kind of has a little bit more richer notes, whereas this definitely has that kind of alcohol hit to you. We'll give it a little taste. So definitely spicy. I get almost like pepper, kind of a leather flavor profile. Obviously the oak that you kind of got with the nose. It's got a smokier flavor profile. It's got a smokier scent profile. A lot of that, I think, comes from that longer char process, as well as that 2-year longer aging process. It's definitely hotter, despite the fact that it isn't hotter, in my opinion. I think that comes from the spice. This one has a lot less rye. It's about 13% rye on it. And I believe it's 75, 77% corn. So it's sweet, but it's also spicy, and it also has that kind of smoky flavor profile. The things that kind of lingers for me is the smoke taste that's on the back end of it. But yeah, it is really one of the great ones coming out of Beam Suntory if you're looking for some of their small batch or some of their select batches. Personally, my favorites go Henry Mckenna, Bibb and Tucker, Knob Creek, and then the Bullet. But again, it's all subjective. Everybody kind of has their own things that they're looking for. If you're looking for a sweeter bourbon, I would maybe recommend you something on the side with higher corn content. If you're looking for a spicier bourbon, I would recommend finding things with a more with a higher rye content. If you want something with a little bit more herbaceousness or maybe higher botanicals, look for something with a little bit more barley rye content. A lot of different things can impart a lot of different flavor profiles, not to mention the barreling, the charring on the barreling, and how the barrel is taken care of. Some distillers will only put certain select barrels in certain parts of their warehouses because they know that is the best part of the warehouse, and they're going to get their best whiskeys from their best barrels by putting them in that area. So there's a lot of different things to get you to the perfect bourbon. But generally speaking, the barreling and the aging is what's going to kind of impart those special specific flavors. The mash bills all kind of, sit around the same area from one to another with a little bit of a change, 2% here, 5% there. But really what you're getting in flavor profile and in taste is coming from those aging processes and the barreling processes. So a lot of fun things. Thoughts on the Papi line of bourbon. Papi is really cool in that they have really made some amazing marketing techniques. If you looked at Papi 20 years ago, you could have picked up a bottle of that at the airport. You could have found it at almost any distiller or at any liquor store. It was very easy to find, but it wasn't something that people went out looking for because it was kind of like the bartender's secret. If you came into a whiskey bar and you were looking for Papi Van Winkle and mentioned to the bartender, it was almost like a secret language between the patron and the bartender that you knew really good rye whiskey. And that was kind of what gave it its notoriety. Now it is such a super highly allocated bourbon that you can never find it. If you do find it, it costs hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars. It is a very amazing whiskey. There are some really great whiskeys out there. Like I said, High West, like we talked about in the chat here, that aren't going to cost you $1,000 and you're still going to get a really great flavor. High West is really neat in that they are not necessarily their own distiller like all of these ones that we've gone through. They come out of Midwest Grain Production, MGP, which is one of the largest whiskey producers in America. And they have a lot of small batch and single barrel things that they work with. So you don't necessarily have to go with one of these higher big name brand whiskeys in order to find a really great bourbon or whiskey out there. They are on the cheaper side, I agree, but they're very easy to find. They've got a lot of great things. Their toasted barrel is amazing. Their rye is really cool. It all just depends on what you're looking for in a whiskey. If you have the money to spend on Papi Van Winkle, I would say go for it. It's always great to have in your collection. It is very hard to get. You can almost, like, I've had only a handful of opportunities in my life to come across it. But if you can, totally do it. If you're looking for something that's kind of on the higher end, that's not necessarily a bourbon or a whiskey, I would recommend Whistle Pig. They're super cool. They're out of Virginia. They do some really great bottle or barrel programs. They have port barrels, they have sherry barrels, they have old wine barrels, and they were one of the first people to kind of do this in that world. So it is something that wasn't really done previously, and now it's one of they sit up there with Pappy Van Winkle in the allocation and the availability, because they're doing something more unique than some of the other whiskey distillers might be doing. So that would be one to check out. In the way, what was that question? Let me see here. Best Scotch recommendations. Honestly, my best Scotch recommendation would be go with a single malt versus a blended, because you're going to get a very clear, distinct flavor profile of what it is that you're looking at. I personally love anything from the Isles. Highland Park is something that you don't, obviously everybody knows Mckenna, and everybody knows Glenfiddich and things of that. I love a single malt Scotch from Highland Park. They do a really great one. And if you're looking at something kind of new to the whiskey world, Japanese whiskey is where I would point to, especially if you're a Scotch fan, because the Japanese are kind of taking that Kaizen approach that they do in everything, and adding it to the amazing world of Scotch. Japanese whiskey has won more awards in the past 4 or 5 years than Scotch has ever won in dozens and dozens of years. And they're a lot more approachable than you might find with some of the Scotches. Scotch, as I mentioned, can be very peaty. It can be very smoky. It can have some really clean, crisp flavor profiles from the water that you're getting, but it also does have a lot more going on than bourbon or Japanese whiskey. So it depends on what you like in a whiskey. If you're thinking, if you love a super smoky, peaty whiskey, go for your Midlands or your Lowlands, because that's kind of what they're going for down there. If you want something a little bit cleaner, go for the Isles. If you want something really unique and clean and out of the realm of Scotch, go for Japanese. But again, it depends on what you're looking for in a whiskey. So there's not really one I would say, absolutely go for this one. I love Chivas Regal. I grew up, my great-grandfather drank Chivas since he was 99 years old. But that's, how Irish people are. They drink whiskey until they die. So it just depends on what you like. But yeah, what was that other question here? What are your thoughts on some of the craft distillers coming up these days, such as the Limestone Branch, Middle East, Castler Key? I think there's a lot of really cool things going on. 20 years ago or so, there was only about 20 or 30 whiskey/bourbon distillers. Now, since the bourbon game is really ramped up, you're looking at upwards to 400 different distillers. So that's a lot of people coming in a very short amount of time. There are so many great unique things going on. Like I mentioned, Whistle Pig is doing a really cool barrel exchange program where they're aging things in port barrels. There's a new distiller called Pinhook that are new to the game out in Kentucky, and their master distiller is basically, he's an ex-winemaker who's taking the approach of winemaking and applying it to whiskey. Every year he's putting out the same mash bill, but instead of allowing the mash bill to be what his focus is, the focus is now how the year has changed the flavor profile of the whiskey. So year 4 is going to come out, and that's the taste. Year 5 comes out, and maybe it was a hotter year, or maybe the barrel had moved. And so that's the flavor profile. Year 6, same thing. And he's doing that from year 4 series all the way up to year 12 series. And the idea here is he wants to show you, or show us, as the consumers, what it is that's imparting the flavor profile to the whiskey. So there's a lot of really cool things going on. There's a lot of mixing it up. There's a lot of, old school stuff. There's a lot of new school stuff. There's a Tennessee whiskey producer that is the only female whiskey producer who actually, her family has the credit of the recipe that Jack Daniels uses, or used to use, the original recipe for Tennessee whiskey. And they're starting their very first African-American owned and female owned and original recipe for Jack Daniels whiskey that's starting to come out into the market now. So there's a lot of really cool things, a lot of really unique things. So I definitely encourage you to kind of break out of the standard Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, Bullet kind of realm, and look at some of these newer things, or some of these more unique things, or things like that. Because there's a lot of really good stuff, and I agree with you. Jack Daniels is not my first choice. I probably cannot. I mean, I know I would refuse to, but I can't drink Jack Daniels. Not saying that they don't have some good things. They have some very amazing things when you start getting into their select barrels and their single barrels and their age statements and all of that. But like standard Jack Daniels off the shelf, not something I would recommend to drink straight or at all. But again, that's my opinion. It's all subjective. I've had the opportunity to taste really great whiskeys, so I might be biased in the sense that, standard black label Jack Daniels is not my go-to. But I will go for the standard yellow label Four Roses any day. And I have, other whiskey sommeliers and things like that who will say, I won't ever drink Four Roses yellow label because it's gross. And same thing for Bullet, and same thing for a lot of things. So, it just depends. You don't have to spend $500 to get a good bourbon. You should probably spend more than $20, because if it's a $20 bourbon, it's probably not a good bourbon. But $40, $50, $60 bourbons are about where you're looking at to find a really good bourbon without having to break the bank. So definitely encourage you guys to get out there and try new things, and push the envelope. If no one liked it, they wouldn't make it. It's all subjective. Yeah, that's right. And there wouldn't be hundreds of, not thousands of bourbons out there if everybody liked the same thing. If that was the case, we'd only have one bourbon and everybody would drink one bourbon, and that would be it. But we all have different tastes. So there's a lot of different things out there. Did we have any other questions for me? I hope you guys enjoyed. Don't feel so inclined to drink all 10 ounces of whiskey in one sitting. You can seal those little bottles back up and go back to them another day. If you want to drink 10 ounces of whiskey in one sitting,
PJ,
hydrate.
you might be too late. They might have already drank it. That might have been too late in the afternoon.
That's
Yeah,
true.
true.
They may have already drank it. If that's the case,
Good luck.
get yourself some water, have a sandwich.
Yeah.
And
PJ, thank you.
Prepare for tomorrow, because it might be a rough day.
Thank you, PJ. Great job.
Well, thank you guys so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Advizex team, for everything y'all do. But on that note, I hope you guys enjoy your day and don't have too terrible of a day tomorrow.
Thanks, PJ.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Thank you,
everyone
guys.
on the
Enjoy
call,
rest of
thank
your-
you. Yeah, we really appreciate everybody
Bye-bye.
being on today. Tanium, thank you very much for the presentation. John, Eric, great jobs today. And
You're welcome.
look forward to getting in contact with the folks that have attended and see if there's any areas we can help. So again, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of the week and have a good weekend.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
How do I get out of here?